1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
The EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Blake Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello and welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 12, and I'm happy to welcome two former guests on the podcast back at the same time. I'd like to welcome back Rich Gilbert. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you, David. How are you?
Yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah, I'm doing good. And I'd also like to welcome Drew back to the show. How are you doing, Drew?
I'm alright, yeah. A little bit tired, but
yeah,
persevering.
Why is Drew just called Drew, and yet I'm Richard Gilbert, like I'm a stranger?
For reasons of mysteriosity.
Yeah. I like to keep my anonymity intact.
And welcome back, Rich, and Deep Throat. But yeah, so I'm glad to invite you both back to the show. It's only the second time we've done a show with two different guests, and only the first time that they've both been returning guests. So yeah, it's great to have you both as a sort of combo. I'm looking at this as the kind of, this is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the sort of Avengers. This is Captain America meeting Thor and immediately having a fight.
Okay.
So, which one of us is Thor? I'm calling you Captain America there, Dave.
Well, you've got the beard, so you're slightly more rugged and Nordic. I think you get a Thor, Drew.
Lovely. I'll take that. Does that make you Iron Man?
Oh, no, I'm not having it. Keep Iron Man. I'll be Ant-Man, the eternally young Paul Rudd.
Accepted.
Yeah, that's a nice choice. The reason I've invited Rich and Drew onto the show is to talk about a kind of perennial fascination of mine. Really, it's been with me since quite an early age of childhood, and I think of all the shows we've done so far, this is probably the nearest to a real favourite of mine. It's something that kind of I think I almost had to convince myself was even worth talking about, to the degree that we're probably about to talk about it. No, that's not true. I love them to bits. It's to talk about the Roadrunner cartoons, and I'm just going to call them the Roadrunner cartoons because obviously you can sort of, in a slightly ungainly way, you can call them the Wile E. Coyote / Roadrunner cartoons, or but what we're mostly talking about is the sort of classic run of Roadrunner cartoons that started in 1949 and ran until 1965. Most of them, I think all of them actually in that run, directed by the legendary Chuck Jones. And we're going to particularly focus on the first 10 of those, which ran from 1949 to 1957. We're not going to go through them all in detail, but we rewatched at least those 10 for the show, just to kind of refresh our memories and kind of get up on the development of the cartoons. I'll talk a little bit about my background with the Roadrunner cartoons and some context for them in a second. But Rich, do you remember seeing these when you were a kid?
Yeah, I'm not sure how I would have done though. I suppose it was one of those things that was just kind of randomly shown on TV. There was no it never felt scheduled. They just always seemed to be on at some point during the day. I couldn't even tell you what channel had the rights to them.
And you, Drew?
Yeah, I concur with what Richard said. Really, it's I can't place what time of day it was, what day of the week it was when when I first saw these, but I remember it being, like the kind of thing that you see on BBC Two before the news in the middle of the day, like if you're off sick from school or something, or if it was the holidays, just sort of like randomly like that, and catching them, and somehow as a child always managing to know when they're on almost instinctively. But yeah, I must have seen them when I was quite young, so I'm going to guess my introduction to them was probably when I was about 4 or 5, and immediately sort of fell in love with how wacky they were.
Yeah, I saw several of them in the same sort of context as that, through TV screenings and that kind of thing, and probably like the odd videotape that had Looney Tunes compilations on it as well. But one thing that kind of really deepened my appreciation, I suppose got me the bug of them really, was me and my brother, I think we rented the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, which was on VHS at the time. And I didn't really know much about the context of that when I was a kid, but what that was a 1979 theatrically released compilation, which was, it was apparent even at the time. It was a sort of portmanteau compilation designed to show you like the best of Looney Tunes, essentially, hosted by Bugs Bunny in a sort of Hugh Hefner robe, talking you through, like, as it was framed, the history of the chase. There's sort of very loose kind of narrative they wove about the films. But that ended that sort of climaxes the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie with I think it's about 15 minutes, but it felt, in a good way, it felt longer when you were a kid. You could just kind of luxuriate in it. It ended with a sort of 15 to 20 minute compilation, which was basically the best of Roadrunner. It was a stitched together, I think quite cleverly put together kind of best of the cartoons, and I think that was all exclusively drawn from that sort of golden age of Chuck Jones Roadrunner cartoons. And they really thought about it. They really took a lot of the best gags, but they also paced it well, and they took a lot of the recurring jokes and things that recur later in the episodes and spaced them out a bit more as well. So it's almost worth, I'll try and include a link in the show notes if I can find it. It seemed quite difficult to get online, but if I can find a link to that bit of the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, it's a great primer for it is a greatest hits album, essentially. And a lot of, when I was rewatching the first 10 cartoons for this show, I recognised loads of the bits with things I usually saw in the context of that. I wanted to talk to you guys about this because I know you're both fans, and I think the Roadrunner cartoons, I used to pontificate. You'll both remember, like I've pontificated a lot since my youth about them, and about how they're kind of like the highest expression of a certain sort of classic, golden age Hollywood cartoon, and obviously we'll talk a little bit about why they're distinctive in a minute. But I think it's it's obviously the fact that they're largely wordless allows them to draw on the kind of purity of silent cinema in that sense, but they're also, it gives them a sort of distinctiveness that doesn't rely on the kind of usual. Because a lot of Looney Tunes cartoons, they have like very distinctive voice actors. Obviously, most of them Mel Blanc. They kind of the characters are indelibly associated usually with a voice, which is often being recreated down the generations now because they've been around so long. But these don't need that, so it gives them a kind of unique style, doesn't it? I mean, Rich, do you think they sort of stand out amongst the rest of the cartoon world from that era?
Yeah, I've recently just rewatched, having known I was doing this, some of the other Warner Brothers cartoons, which essentially boil down to a chase, like Hunter and sort of smart ass animal. And if you've just watched about several hours worth of, well, a lot of Roadrunner, I find that the sort of Bugs Bunny's wisecracking a little bit irritating, which I never used to as a kid. But when you've basically had all of that just captured silently, with beep beep and and the Roadrunner sticking its tongue out, it kind of grates that then. So yeah, I certainly prefer it without the smart assery.
Well, it allows it arguably to be a bit more timeless, doesn't it, in some ways?
Yeah, it is, and also it kind of makes the. Does it make the Coyote's inevitable failures more tragic or less? Like, so if Elmer Fudd, for example, is being taunted by Bugs Bunny and Bugs is annoying you, do you feel for Elmer more than you would the Coyote who's just being screwed over by, I don't know, the universe? I don't know. But I more or less prefer the silent thing, yeah. But I like silent slapstick as well, so that could be it.
What's your take on that, Drew?
I agree. I think the silence is something that is one of its strengths, definitely, with these particular characters. And each character, Porky Pig, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, they all have sort of distinctive speech patterns as well. So you could recognise them if you know those characters well, without having seen them as well. The fact that these characters don't have a voice, that kind of makes them a bit more. To me, sort of a bit more relatable, because they're you can picture yourselves a bit more in their shoes. I think for me, it's like you can relate to both sides. You kind of want to be the Roadrunner. You kind of want to be cool and slick, and you kind of want to be wily. You'll find in life that you will be put up against obstacles that you don't necessarily sort of like foresee coming.
I think when I was a teenager, I pretentiously described the Warner Brothers universe as sort of being divided into sort of good luck and bad luck gods. Almost like they're usually twinned. Not often in sort of chase cartoons, but even if you're at the head of the pyramid, if you like, if you've got Daffy and Bugs, and they're kind of, it's almost like Bugs is this sort of character who can manipulate, because he's a cartoon character, not just the sort of verbal power of his world, and like he's very persuasive and he's very tricksterish, but he's also can manipulate the reality of his world to a certain degree. And Daffy's like that, but every time he tries to do that, the world collapses in on him. Like a landslide buries him. And it's kind of, and I think most of the Warner Brothers cartoon pairings are like that, aren't they? It's probably something about just in the Roadrunner, the force of nature character, the often oblivious character. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well, but and that colliding with someone who's eternally frustrated. It's really quite basic and primal. I wanted to talk briefly about why I think these are such a pinnacle of, because we'll get into talk about some of the the craftsmanship and the formula in a good way of the cartoons later, but the makers of the cartoons themselves, I can't remember who it was attributed to, maybe Michael Maltese, who wrote quite a few of them. But he said that
he wrote the first 20 years worth.
Yeah, I mean, him and Chuck Jones are kind of the auteur pair on a lot of these, really, and and obviously they were doing a tremendous amount of other stuff. This is a golden age of cartoons. If you look at the stuff they were doing in between all these cartoons, but there are many seminal works in there. There's loads of stuff happening in this decade. They themselves said that the Roadrunner cartoons were seen as, I think the phrase used was a parody of Tom and Jerry. So I think a lot of their DNA is Tom and Jerry, of course, but it's distilled down by, it's got that wordlessness of sort of classic Tom and Jerry cartoons. But obviously the Tom and Jerry cat and mouse dynamic is one where the cat is trying to catch or defeat the mouse, but the mouse is aware of that and is fighting back, and it's sort of a David and Goliath thing. There's a lot in the DNA of Roadrunner. When I was at university, I read about the, I think it's George Merriman classic cartoon strip Crazy Cat, which was... it's relatively obscure now, I think, especially for non-Americans, but it was huge in the first half of the 20th century. It came from a newspaper strip, and Crazy Cat, the basic premise is that a sort of holy fool kind of character, Crazy Cat, is going around all the time causing chaos and mischief. But this villain character, Ignatz Mouse, is obsessed with throwing a brick at Crazy Cat. But Crazy Cat doesn't realise that Ignatz Mouse hates him. He's kind of... He sees the brick, if anything, as like a sign of affection, and he just, it makes him all the more annoying to Ignatz Mouse, who's always trying to throw the brick at him. So it's kind of like a Homer Simpson, Frank Grimes kind of relationship. Crazy Cat doesn't realise that this person loathes him, and loathes him all the more oblivious he is to it. The one other reason I mentioned Crazy Cat is that it's famous for having very surreal kind of southern bayou / Midwestern desert landscapes, and especially like landscapes that change in constitution between frames of the comic strip panel. Some of the surreal desert landscapes that you see later in these classic Chuck Jones cartoons in the Roadrunner landscape, the stereotype of it is almost the sort of rock formation that starts very like needle thin at the bottom and gets very wide at the top. Things like that come from Crazy Cat. But I think more than that dynamic of obliviousness, I think the Roadrunner cartoons take that Tom and Jerry antagonism and the obliviousness of Crazy Cat and marry them so that you've got this character pairing when at its best the Coyote is fanatically, Ahab-esque obsessed with catching the Roadrunner, and the Roadrunner, I think, at the best pairing of that, barely notices him, if at all. Yeah,
my favourite ones are always when the Roadrunner is essentially like not just oblivious, but more or less like doesn't stop. When he zooms through the trap or whatever it is, and that's it. Like I don't even like it when he stops to taunt him. But yeah, any ones where the Roadrunner intervenes and that causes the plan to go awry, with some exceptions, are my least favourite ones. So yeah, but yeah, the thing I like about the environment is the fact that it just, in fact, there's very rarely anything else there. It isn't domestic like Tom and Jerry, and it's so surreal. Regularly the physics gives way. Like it seems like it's either primal or some sort of like weird other world that, apart from the occasional Acme truck, that it's like a weird sort of Escher meets John Ford meets De Chirico world. I don't know. Another reason I love them so much, I guess.
I'll bring that back to Drew in a sec, because Drew expressed something similar when we were talking off mic, but I think that the timelessness of the desert setting is right, because I think someone pointed out, years after we saw The Lion King in the 90s, that The Lion King, because it's a Disney film with no human characters, even on the periphery, like Bambi has, for example, The Lion King could be happening at any time in the last sort of 10 million years. It's not, or in the future. Indeed, like it doesn't rely on a sort of any kind of dated setting in that sense. Although obviously culturally it's hugely dated, hugely back to the mid-90s. I suppose the nearest thing in the Wile E. Coyote cartoons, the Roadrunner cartoons you have, is the sort of mail order prevalence, which then was be quite a recent thing in that sense. But then obviously that's not gone anywhere now, as we all know. Drew, you were saying something similar, weren't you, about the like the obliviousness of the Roadrunner when we were talking yesterday?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely adds a sort of level of it's him being really nonchalant and just indifferent makes it funnier, I think, somehow. But I can't really put my finger on why. There are like I have in my sort of like favorite gags of the episodes that we watched. There are a couple of examples of where Roadrunner's intervention is kind of what elevates it for me, but I don't even like it really too much when Roadrunner turns his head back and sort of sticks his tongue out and does the beep beep thing. So yeah, I like it when he's just completely almost oblivious, but mostly indifferent. And I do like the idea that he doesn't really see the coyote as a threat. He's just kind of like running because he likes running. There's no he doesn't really see this sort of like predator that's out to catch him. He's just seeing this. Oh, there's another like living soul in this universe.
Yeah, and I think the key thing there is like it's when he the Roadrunner shouldn't really have an active role in overcoming Wile's traps, should he? Like he should just be the moving part in them, or the moving part that goes through them. But I think one of like there's a gag in one of the Roadrunner cartoons where like the coyotes, I think he's using like hypnosis or something, that he's like self-taught hypnosis to try and control the Roadrunner, and the Roadrunner zooms into frame with a mirror that reflects the hypnosis back at him. Which is funny, and it's a funny gag just in isolation. But I'm such a Roadrunner purist, you might say, that I'm like, he shouldn't have a plan. He shouldn't have a counter plan.
Yeah,
no, it's not like it should go wrong for a reason which is unconnected to the Roadrunner's actions.
While I was doing this, I was trying to think of a sort of typology of Wile E. Coyote schemes, and I've got a few ideas, a few sort of recurring motifs that happen, and there is a very, very small one, which is what goes wrong is the Roadrunner running up and ruining his plan, rather than it going wrong for reasons of poor execution, dodgy kit, or the universe conspiring, which are the best ones. There's only a few where the Roadrunner intervenes, and I like those least. Apart from one, which is a later one of the ones I remember when I was a kid. So it begins with the normal setup, like the one that establishes Coyote is chasing Roadrunner, and it ends with it's a really quick one. Roadrunner just comes up behind him and goes beep beep, and it makes him jump, and he bangs his head or something. And then that happens about 3 or 4 times in a row, gradually with more sort of extreme results. Just makes him jump and he falls off a cliff. And it's only happens about 3 or 4 times, but it's the most condensed version of that joke where something starts kind of funny, happens again is less funny, happens 3rd time isn't funny at all, and the 4th time is really, really funny. That's the only exception I can think of where the Roadrunner's like actually teasing him that did make me laugh. And it ends with a kind of soft gag at the end where the Roadrunner basically turns to camera and says with a little sign, I can't do it again. It would be cruel. It would be cruel. I think basically he just looks at the camera, holds up a sign that says it would be too cruel, and walks off.
There's a bit I was talking to Drew about off mic where we'll go through some of this, but in one of the first 10 cartoons, there's one of the cartoons that ends with the coyote like plummeting to his doom, and he turns to the camera and pleads with the animator to end the cartoon before he hits the ground. Yeah. And he does. It goes to black before you even get an explosion, mercifully. But I was thinking that drawing on Chuck Jones's other work, that's very Duck Amuck, isn't it? In sort of Daffy Duck seminally talking to camera and talking to the animator and getting frustrated with the animator and the animator manipulating the world around him. This is like pleading for a mercy killing from the animator.
Well, yeah, Duck Amuck is just that taken to the absurd. Like that's the reductio ad absurdum of the cartoon character who is aware that he is in a cartoon.
Yeah.
Well, that was my point with David with that particular ending, and I like that sort of like fade to black, that circle sort of zoning in on the coyote just before he hits the ground. And so you never have that payoff. It's nice to know that maybe with that one he survived, but I saw that as him pleading to the universe, not to the animator, or not to the audience either. Just please,
Make it
something,
stop.
something, yeah, something that I need this to not happen this time.
Well, he lives in a particularly cruel universe where, on account of it being an animation, everything is designed so that within the course of 2 minutes, physics will be inconsistent, but only to spite him. Physics will remain consistent until the point where he needs to lose, and then it will, which is the best thing about that. Which reminds me actually of it's a bit of a leap, and it's a pattern of influence is the other way around. If you ever played any of the LucasArts point and clicks in the early 90s, late 80s, which are very self-aware and very cartoony, and where the character will say, "These programmers have made this puzzle too hard," but that's a very explicit reference to Warner Brothers cartoons.
Yeah, and I suppose you've got a lot of the Looney Tunes DNA and other kind of fourth wall breaking video games like Earthworm Jim in the 90s as well, haven't you? Which take on some of that cartoonish aesthetic as well.
I made a note actually, if we're talking about computer games, because in the second episode that you asked us to watch, Dave, I saw sort of potential prototypes for side-scrolling games, because there's like aerial views of like, you know, like points on a map where Roadrunner and Coyote are sort of chasing each other, and that really made me think of sort of, you know, those really simple games like Asteroids and things. So I'm wondering whether because these must have you know, been decades ahead of like those sorts of computer games coming out, I wonder if these had an influence on that, and whether that kind of like cat and mouse aesthetic of this sort of like this animation, even though it's two dots, whether that's sort of influenced some games as well, like Pac-Man, for instance. But yeah,
I know what you mean. It gets almost diagrammatic, doesn't it? And you've got those kind of equivalents where you've got the aerial shots of the roads as well, where they're zooming around and, you know, meeting each other in the middle and things like that. I'm glad you brought up video games, actually, because I wanted to, at some point in this, to mention that conversation we had about how difficult it would be to make a satisfying video game out of the Roadrunner cartoons, because we got into a big talk about how you could do an open world game recreating that desert environment. Obviously, you could have the Roadrunner going around, you could have some sort of level of AI, which meant that it moved unpredictably, that kind of thing. But it would be creating a video game with a sort of comedy reward system, in a sense, you know, like one where you were the coyote, you can make traps. There's loads of different permutations of traps you can make, but the win condition is not a win condition; it's a lose condition. The point is to lose in as amusing a way as possible. And, you know, the only thing I could compare it to would be something a bit like Tony Hawk's, you know, like a game where like the stunts you perform rack up points. But the point is how ornate it is, or how elegant the failure of it is. And I think that would almost, I think we talked about it a bit, you know, none of us are game designers, obviously, but like the challenge of, I mean, it's almost like a challenge beyond, like, it gets a bit philosophical, you know, how would you program an AI to have a sense of humour?
Well, I don't think you could, because I think that you could, sort of Tony Hawk style, have sort of a point system for like the more elaborate Rube Goldberg style stunts where you get, I don't know, points for every single stage in the chain of cause and effect, and that'd be funny. But sometimes they're the sort of least funny ones, and the most funny ones are where it's just like one very, very simple mechanic that goes wrong for reasons, you know, for one of the many reasons it does: incompetence, bad kit, or the universe.
Yeah, like, well, we'll talk about some of these when we go through the gags in more detail, but there's one, isn't there, where literally all the coyote's done is just, I don't know, measured the rope wrong or something, and he just jumps off a cliff and just lands on the cliff immediately below it. It's only a drop of about 4 meters or something. You know, it's more humiliating than anything else.
It's that episode in the middle of the first 10 run, I think it's like 4 or 5, where it properly finds its feet, and there's a run in the middle of it of about 3 or 4 jokes which are really quick in a row, and they're all just the best versions of that joke. He's on a cliff, he's tied off to a rope, he's going to swing across the canyon, he jumps off, and there's just another ledge below him, and he just slams into that.
I've got to say, even from like childhood, I always enjoyed those Rube Goldberg sort of like ideas though.
Oh yeah, me too.
And there's quite a lot of gags in this where you don't see the like what the coyote's doing. Initially you see like the boxes he's unpackaged or the blueprints he's drawn, and then you see the gag. And I kind of like that build up, or like one of my favorite gags is in the very first one. It involves a freezer, a meat grinder, and some skis, and it's like you see those boxes unpackaged. And I just, when I saw that rewatching it, I was like, how's he put this together? What is he doing? And then when you see it put together in such a extraordinary way, that's kind of satisfying a little bit to me. I agree. It's not like the funniest in terms of like where the gag goes wrong, because there's so much that could go wrong. I think it's funnier when the simplest things go wrong.
It sometimes does feed into the Rube Goldberg elaborateness, don't they? And that's obviously often very elegantly set up. Like we've talked before about that gag. Which one of the best versions of that gag where you start at the bottom of a cliff and you see the bottom of a chute, and then it pans up the cliff and you see like this huge like ornate chute that's going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it goes right up into this wooden chute, obviously designed to take something, and you go up to the top of the cliff and the coyote's there and he's got a bomb, and the bomb's in the chute, and he's just about to light the bomb, and you've seen this whole thing and it seems pretty airtight, but of course the premise, it's almost like it keeps exposing these premises that make it, part of the reason you laugh when the gag goes off is that you think, oh, there's a premise I never questioned here. The premise here is the fact that the bomb would have a delayed fuse. He assumes the bomb would have a delayed fuse, presumably that's what he was promised, and the bomb just explodes instantly, rendering that entire setup pointless.
That's one of my favourite ever jokes in Roadrunner. That one, yeah, I love it. Like the ones that Drew was describing, I do like those, but they actually vary. Like I was saying earlier on about that sort of that typology of gags. They vary into which ones they fit in, because sometimes they work. They don't work because the kit's dodgy. Sometimes they don't work because he's massively overestimated their power or something, or he goes too far and goes over a cliff, or something like that. So some are better than others. But it's only later. It's about like the ones in the 50s or late 50s where they properly get Rube Goldberg-y. Like, you light a match which lights a candle, which then causes a string to snap, a ball goes rolling, and then by the end of it, the last trap goes off and it crushes the coyote.
Mm. It's simple again, isn't it? It's one of the best ones in the very first cartoon. This is Fast and Furious, the one that kicks off the whole cycle in 1949. One of the best ones is do you remember he just gets a Superman? I think it's called, is it called a Superman or a superhero outfit? And you just see him put it on, and he's got it on. He looks ridiculous, but he's really, really confident, and he starts leaping. And he's like going slightly higher every time, like towards the edge of the cliff. Goes off the cliff. Heroic music is playing, and of course he just plummets because it's nothing. It's a costume.
I like how that.
It's just such a great gag. It's like, why did he think that would work?
Well, he's almost got quite an innocent, childlike mind, hasn't he? I think in some respects, and that he puts these things together just expecting them to work, as children do. I remember being a kid and thinking, "Oh, this is definitely." I remember being a kid and building, and I don't know if I want to say this on on a podcast. I built a nest for the Cadbury's parrot because I was in love with the Cadbury's parrot, and I was absolutely certain that if I built a nest in my garden and filled it with Cadbury's mini eggs, that the Cadbury's parrot would come and try to hatch them. So, like, as a child, of 17, no, of like 4 or 5, that was going to work to me. That was that my little illogical brain thought that this is definitely maybe Warner Brothers cartoons had influenced me a bit too much, but I like that he has that kind of innocence. I like that Wile E. Coyote just expects things like that to work, and then they just don't. But
also it's because he can't actually win, because full well that if Roadrunner put that costume on, he would have flown.
That would have been a great gag.
Well, that you can imagine that gag being completed in that way, couldn't you? Like, you see a cliff next to him, the Roadrunner's unpacked a similar costume, and he just zooms off into the air.
Precisely. It must be very frustrating when there is no sense of normal laws of cause and effects. Like yesterday, this thing happened. Presumably, that the laws of physics still hold, and it will happen again. Not necessarily. The only law is that you will lose. That's the only law.
There's a classic example. Actually, one of the classic examples of the sort of platonic ideal of the Roadrunner gag is I think they do this in one of the very early ones, one of the first 3 at least, is the kind of whole. There's a rock face and you paint a tunnel on it, and the gag usually is that the Roadrunner runs straight through it because for the Roadrunner it penny crayon-esque works magically, and then the coyote tries to do it and slams into the wall. But I actually realised I think it's in about the 8th one. They actually do the reverse of that gag as well, where the coyote's painted to get the Roadrunner to stop. He's painted the bridge being out. When it's not, he's painted a fallen bridge where there's actually a continuous road, and in that case, the Roadrunner obliviously ignores this and just runs straight through it because there's still a road there. And then the coyote tries to chase, and his painting has become real for him. And he plunges off this imaginary painted bridge.
There's a nice little progression of those, because in episode 1 or episode 2, he does the first ever one. Paints a tunnel on. Roadrunner runs through. He tries to go through the tunnel that he's just painted on 2 seconds ago. Hits the wall. 3 episodes later, he paints a tunnel. Roadrunner goes through it. He tries to run through it. He starts to go through, but then a truck comes, and then he tries to run through again and hits the wall. Then there's the one where that you just described, where he paints the canvas of the bridge, and there's a few later as well, which you can put down in the types where he tries to create an artificial environment to fool the Roadrunner that briefly and inexplicably becomes real in ways that he can't win. There's one where the Roadrunner's like running through a canyon, like a really narrow canyon or a ravine. And so he runs to the end of it and places down some rail tracks that cross the road. They don't go anywhere. They're dead either side. Then he places a stop sign and rings a bell, like a level crossing sign, and then gets a record player out and plays a record that says like level crossing sound effects. And then the Roadrunner stops at the level crossing, and the Roadrunner and the coyote just leaps out to get him, and his course is killed by a train. Of course he is.
It's funny you mentioned the level crossing sound effects record. There are, although these cartoons are mostly wordless, there's not much written down except for the product names. That's where you get some of the nicer gags, isn't it? Like I think it's in about the 8th one. He's reading that book called How to Tar and Feather a Roadrunner, and it just has that little subtitle. Is it 8th printing?
I like sort of looking into that universe and sort of seeing little details that make it seem like a bit more established. Those tunnel gags, they're a real sort of iconic Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote thing. I think they're the gags that I think just this, rather than these elaborate setups, just simply painting a tunnel on a wall.
I think it's that and the coyote falling off a cliff with the top down view, and just disappearing into a river.
In terms of gag variations, there's it wasn't in any of the first 10 that I watched for this show, but certainly showcased in the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie. I think it sort of climaxes with this. There's a sequence in one of the later Chuck Jones ones where there's a catapult. Obviously, there's a few catapults in the cartoons, but you might know the one I mean. I don't know if your rewatch touched on this one, Rich, but there's one where he buys a catapult, and it's just that sort of standard, bent one, like catapult, like getting ready to fire a boulder at the Roadrunner, and over the course of about 4 minutes, it might be like most of the cartoon, everything that can possibly go wrong with that goes wrong. It's like it's glorious. It starts with just he's just standing beside the rock, he pulls the rope and the rock falls on him, and then next time he puts it, the entire catapult flips over and falls on him, and the next time he pulls it, it catapults him over, instead of the rock, and it just every possible thing,
I think that one, I might be wrong, but it sounds like that montage from the film is actually a montage of different catapult gags from different episodes, because obviously there's quite a few. My favourite being the one where he's like, the catapult's there and he just cuts the rope and the boulder remains stationary. It's quite a common joke of it, and the catapult itself just flips around the boulder, and then it doesn't even crush the coyote, but then the boulder then just rolls off onto him, which is the best bit.
That's good. I quite like, there's one where there's like a catapult, and I think the coyote's pulled himself into it, and he cuts the rope behind him that's stuck to a tree, but it just doesn't go anywhere. It just stays there. So he steps out of it, and then he's looking, and he's sort of like, the Roadrunner's long gone by now, and he's sort of like he's sort of trying to investigate, he's trying to like pull on it, and he sticks his head in it, and at that point it sort of releases and goes, fires him head first into a cliffside or something. But I just kind of like that, like bending of physics, because it's you never really know whether they're going to use physics sort of like realistically. Like there's a few gags where like he'll get into like a cannon, say, and then the cannon will fire backwards, but he'll stay in the same place, and that kind of feels fairly believable. That kind of feels like it's possible for that if there's no chocks behind the cannon or something. But there's the odd one where it just defies the laws of physics, and I kind of like that you never really know what you're going to get with it. It's just, it can be completely wild, or it can be grounded with some sort of logic.
Yeah, and it gloriously plays on a sort of childish understanding or lack of understanding of the universe in that sense, doesn't it? Because remember when you were a kid growing up, you ask kind of when you're still learning basic physics, you ask things like if you're in a moving car on the motorway, for example, and you throw a tennis ball up in the air, childish logic would seem to dictate that the tennis ball would fly rapidly back to the back of the car, because the ball is suddenly free of you, so it should be you don't understand inertia properly yet, that all that kind of stuff. And I think Roadrunner plays on that. We'll get talking about this when we talk about the episodes a little bit more. But I've said to both of you before we even started to record this, that my favourite gag in all of the Roadrunner cartoons is a variant on physics not working as it should, because it's one of the it's like a lot of the best gags in this. It's the way it's framed. One thing on this rewatch I was noticing is that if you're talking about these as kind of having the cartoon equivalent of cinematography, quite a lot of the best gags are done by revealing or like by pull outs and zoom outs and obviously pans over landscapes and things like that. One of the really simple ones I noticed on this rewatch was this one where he's just rolling a boulder. It's really so simple. The Roadrunner's running down the road. He's poised to roll a boulder down onto it from a curved hillside, and he does that, and it just misses the Roadrunner. So that's just bad luck, really. That's just bad luck. But at the same time, the camera's pulling out to show you that the curvature of the rock on the other side of the road is just perfect, so that you can already see before any of it starts happening that the rock is going to roll all the way up it and curve just right back onto him. And the camera reveals that, and then it just plays out over the next 6 seconds. It's just great. You didn't have every piece of the puzzle. He should have done, but you didn't.
That's one of the ones that in that perfect run of like there's about 3 or 4 great boulder gags in a row in one of the episodes, and that's one of them.
I like that. The same sort of like ideas are used in various ways, because I often use Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner as a metaphor for when things go wrong, like in life or in family situations. And it's like, why don't we just try that again? Why don't we just try the same thing again because we got so close? And I kind of like that. If you try the same thing again, things might go wrong in the same way again or in completely new ways. And I should probably rethink my metaphors, but yeah, I still use like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner as a metaphor for basically saying let's try this again, because it did frustrate me as a kid when you saw him get so close to his goals, or I thought he had a really good idea, and he was maybe just right, within pause distance of catching the Roadrunner. And then he didn't, but he didn't try that same thing again. And it's like, come on, just do that every time until you get him.
Yeah, well, there's a part of a lot of children, isn't there, who kind of want to, on some level, see the villain win. And Wile E. Coyote is kind of an anti-hero, isn't he? He's kind of an identification figure, and he is. It's like Rich, you were saying. One of the reasons the Roadrunner cartoons hold up so well is that they're not almost like tainted or dated by sort of domesticity or like identifiable 1940s, 1950s usually US surroundings. Let's say, you only need to think about the sort of maid character in Tom and Jerry, for example, for an easy go-to of why that might not be so easy.
Well, that's not aged well, has it?
But I think another reason because you get really pretentious about the cartoons and talk about them as like being very existential and all that sort of stuff.
And we will.
But the coyote is, and we will. I'm sure we will. But the coyote is. He is out in the desert. He's starving and out in the desert. That's your basic premise. And he's tried to convince himself that a sort of a rusty old can is haute cuisine. Like he's getting it, like cooking it to perfection, and it's only revealed to be a can when he's done with all that.
Well, and it even sits down. He's about to cut it up, and then goes, "No, actually, it's a can," and throws it away. There's some good ones later on as well, which is speaking about how funny he is, where he captures like a mouse. And he captures it to try and test on it some Acme like speed potion. Like if you drink it, you get super speed, that kind of thing. And he tests it on the mouse. And obviously, if you were remotely like applying any laws of reason, you'd say, "Eat the mouse. You're a starving carnivore." But it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter what I'm actually eating. I just have to kill that Roadrunner.
You could say the same for the birdseed, really. Like, just eat the birdseed. He's got like an endless supply of birdseed, and he's omnivorous.
And he's clearly making money if he can afford all that stuff from Acme. He's clearly got an income.
Yeah.
Order a takeaway.
That'd be a good gag, wouldn't it? It'd be a great gag if he'd like if there was one gag where he'd like laid a table with like this sumptuous banquet to try and lure the Roadrunner in, and then you like I don't know what happens, like the sumptuous banquet gets blown up or thrown over a cliff or something like that, and he just sort of looks at the camera after it. He's like. Hang on. Yeah, well, that's where it ties into sort of silent cinema legacy as well, or sort of not legacy, or its influences, isn't it? Because you've got kind of quite a bit of Chaplin in there, anyway, because he's essentially a starving hobo. You know, this is where you get the Chaplin DNA, and you get tons of the Buster Keaton stuff in there. Although Buster Keaton's thing was he always managed to have a bit of sort of innate dignity somehow. You know, whereas probably really what I mean is Harold Lloyd. You know, just being in these terrifyingly precarious situations.
Yeah, Harold Lloyd, it's sort of Buster Keaton sort of managed to get out of all his scrapes using his Buster Keaton's slapstick got him out of the messes he was in. Well, in the ones I can remember anyway, like in The General and stuff. Whereas Harold Lloyd didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Harold Lloyd conveys more of that, you know, like in the sort of famous hanging off the clock sequence and stuff. You know, you get more of that kind of coyote kind of franticness, don't you? Because while the coyote is you know, he's very pleased with himself up till the moment when he's absolutely terrified. That tends to be his arc.
Yeah, but with an actual human, you can't have him dying, I guess. or you can't have him falling off a building to the floor and expect the audience to believe that he just climbs out of a hole shaped like him.
Yeah, well, like, is it Keaton that with the famous sort of house falling scene?
Yes.
Is that Keaton?
Yes. When the house falls
Yeah,
down.
that's in a couple of different Buster Keaton movies. I can't believe, you know, like, you can't believe that anyone did that, but that they did it twice.
Yeah. Oh, it's remarkable. But the thing I love about it is it's that indifference. He's almost closer to the Roadrunner in that respect, because he's not, you know, he doesn't he just bend down to pick up something and the house falls and there's a window that perfectly goes over him.
He stands in exactly the one sort of, I think he said, like 2 meter space where anywhere else he would have been dead.
Yeah. Literally dead.
Yeah. No, but Buster Keaton's incredible. Almost everything he did in his career is incredible. I think there's I think I'll take a break in a sec, but and then we'll come back and we'll talk not only a little bit more about the gags, but also kind of some of the other aesthetics of the cartoons. But I also just want to talk a little bit after the break about the sort of very basic, because this isn't like a detailed cartoon sort of history podcast, but like talk a little bit about the basic biography of Chuck Jones and how they came to be making those cartoons in 1949 and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, let's take a short break. I'll play a clip of something, given that they're largely vocalist cartoons. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to play here, but you, the listeners, will know in a sec. See you soon. Welcome back. We've already touched on quite a lot that we like about the Roadrunner cartoons, guys, but I just wanted to sort of, well, in a sense, rewind a little bit and kind of go through some of the things that they do in a semi-chronological manner, but just to highlight some of the things we like about it a bit more. Looking into this, because I was very vague on the whole sort of timeline of the Roadrunner cartoons. I knew that most of the ones that I really loved were made in the sort of 1950s, maybe early 60s, because of course post Chuck Jones run they become less good. I think, you know, this is not me being a cartoon snob. This is actually something I've thought since seeing them sort of randomly put together on a video as a kid. There's all sorts of things we could say about sort of, you know, post Golden Age animation, the reasons why it got cheaper, why it got quicker, you know, why it got more formulaic in a less good way. But the first Roadrunner cartoon was, as we mentioned before, Fast and Furious, which was made in 1949. So we're talking about the like the Truman presidency. This is like how far back these things go. I mean, the Warner Brothers up till then, you know, the Warner Brothers basically became a proper sort of codified studio in the 1920s, the early 1920s, and they were putting out animations as a fairly early part of that. They were quite quick to get on that train. I think it's from about 1931 they were putting out, I think it was Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes as sort of labels came out quite soon. They were both riffing as names off the silly symphonies that Disney had put in place. I looked into the difference of that because as a kid you might have had the same thing. I was always a bit confused about what Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes were and whether they coexisted, what they meant as brands. Turns out to be something quite technical, essentially to do with Warner Brothers music licensing, and also I think Merry Melodies, I think it was, were in colour, and that back when colour was becoming a thing in cartoons as much as it was in live action in the 30s, they were the colour ones, and Looney Tunes were in black and white for longer, and Merry Melodies were designed to showcase Warner Brothers songs, so they each had a song per episode. Looney Tunes weren't; they were more purely anarchic. And so what you have then in the 1940s and leading up to the period we're discussing is you have a sort of fusion of those, because obviously Looney Tunes went to colour soon anyway, and they stopped using the songs because the contractual reasons became less important, and so you basically get them being used interchangeably. So Bugs Bunny started as, I think, a Merry Melodies star, and then he starts being used in Looney Tunes, and then eventually there's a point where he's used in more Looney Tunes than Merry Melodies. So eventually they started just assigning these names kind of, because it's all Warner Brothers, you know, it's all Warner Brothers Studios, so they just assign them randomly after that. Obviously in 1949 it's the immediate post-war period, and Chuck Jones had made his name as an animator earlier in the late 30s, early 40s. He'd been a bit of a union guy, apparently. He was quite a union organizer under is it what's he called, Schlesinger, who did a lot of the sort of studio, owned a lot of the studio stuff back then, and he'd made quite a lot of strides for sort of unionization of animators and cartoon animators. He'd also worked on the Roosevelt re-election campaign, Chuck Jones, making some campaign films in the 44 campaign, the one that got Roosevelt his final and truncated term. So it's an interesting dude. As I say, he started working early on with Michael Maltese, who'd also had an interesting career in sort of, you know, cartoon writing and going up through the 30s, and they're both quite experienced, you know, middle-aged guys basically when this sort of golden age came upon them, and they worked a lot together, including with a whole raft of other Warner Brothers studio animators, sound effects guys, you know. I think I remember saying to you guys that I think the best job of the 20th century I can imagine, and I'm sort of slightly idealising it obviously, is being one of the writers on the Roadrunner cartoons, but I think the second best job I can imagine in the 20th century is being the sound effects guy on the Roadrunner cartoons, because so much of them, you know, everything from the sort of plummeting of noises of the coyote to all the explosions, you know, and collisions and everything, they're just great, aren't they? It's kind of, me and my brother used to be obsessed with the Goon Show as kids, you know, and obviously they used to do a lot of their sound effects kind of from records and stuff like that, you know, but it kind of as live, you know. I think, you know, it'd be so interesting to go back and see some of this stuff being done. But to bring it back to the Fast and the Furious, because so we're going to run through these cartoons, like the first 10 briefly. We're not going to do, obviously you can't exactly do synopses of them because they're mostly plotless, you know. They're just, you know, beat after beat after beat. But we just want to talk a little bit about what the things that stood out for us. So yeah, what do you guys think of this one?
I think I touched on it earlier. This is the first time we see like the unboxing before the gag, and you see 3 components. This is the one where you've got a freezer, a meat grinder, and a pair of skis. I can't even remember how that gag ends. Like I was so sort of like focused
badly, I'd imagine.
Oh, probably with a big bang, yeah.
I think it's one of the ones where he just zooms down the hill, zooms past Roadrunner, and then goes up, I think, into a wall or off a cliff. I think it's one of the ones where the joke is mainly what an elaborate setup for such a simple and inevitable end.
I think it is something as simple as he runs out of ice. But I just kind of like that. Like, that was the first instance of us seeing sort of this inventiveness. So that's something that stood out to me. And I think it's also an episode where you see the painted tunnel as well. So as early on as that, you see the painted tunnel.
I already touched on the super suit gag, so I won't go into that again. But I like there's two equally basic jokes in this. One is where he's just riding a giant rocket and it's on the launch pad, it's just about to take off, and it just goes straight up. That's not his plan, and it just smashes into a cliff.
There's a couple of those ones where he's on the rocket and it just doesn't go where he wants it to.
Yeah. There is.
They reuse that a few times. Yeah.
There's also a very basic one where it's kind of, again, it's just just subtly the opposite happens that you're led to believe by your understanding of the world. Is he's got a dynamite plunger. The dynamite plunger is connected by a cable to the dynamite. You see all this. He pushes the plunger and the plunger blows up instead of the dynamite.
Yeah.
Just things like that. Did you have a highlight of this first one, Rich?
I can't really ever remember which episodes are in which. I could happily list my favourite gags. Apart from there's one that I do know is in episode 2 because it introduces one of my favourite kinds of gag. Again, like going into that sort of idea that there are certain ways that these things can go wrong. There's one that I'm very, very clear on. I'm almost certain it's episode 2.
Well, you can talk about that straight away then, because Beep Beep was the second one produced, and that came out in 1952. Yeah. So there was quite a big. I should say, I'd say there's a big gap between this one. Obviously, they were making tons of cartoons, and there was no idea of this as being a sort of mini franchise yet. I'm not actually. It'd actually be quite interesting to know why they made a second one, why they thought it had promise. Or whether they were just had a busy month basically, and decided they had to pull out a sort of tried and tested thing. But yeah, so Beep Beep is in 1952, and what was the gag you're thinking of from that one, Rich?
So it's one that doesn't start very promisingly. It's the one where he's by hook or by crook he's chased Roadrunner down a mine, and it appears to be an excuse to do another one of those sort of top-down, sort of Pac-Man-esque, sort of proto Pac-Man. See the little dots running through the tunnel, which they do in episode 1 with a road map, and it goes on a bit, and you go, well, what's the joke? And basically, before you know it, then it cuts to a cross-section view, so you can now see the side-on sort of a platform-style coyote running in the dark, and it gradually gets darker and darker and darker until you can just see, classic cartoon style, his eyes in pitch black. He then lights a match and is surrounded by TNT. It's everywhere, like, wall-to-wall TNT. Obviously, his explosion. I love the gags where basically out of nowhere, and there's nothing he could have done about it, his doom arrives.
What's your highlight of this one, Drew?
Well, firstly, I like that. I did like that one that you said, Rich. That came in a very close second. I was sort of like torn, but I like it. It's really simple. It's like a boxing glove on a spring, and he's put this like boxing glove, spring, and then a rock, and the tension sort of mounted, and like the Roadrunner runs past, he releases the spring, but the rock just goes backwards and slams him into a wall, and the boxing glove just stays in place. And it's that playing with physics. That's sort of the first point of when. You're thinking that the lighter object is going to be thrown forwards, but actually the rock gets thrown backwards. I just thought that was very simple.
Yeah, that's great.
There's a great bit in this one where the mine that he's chasing the Roadrunner through is labelled as the Old Cactus Mine, which is great as well. It's just a silly joke, but it kind of adds to the surrealism of the landscape, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This place where cactus is a mined thing.
It's almost like they're mining props for a fictional desert.
yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. It's a strange place, isn't it? Because as you say, it's deserted, but it's filled with the world of the Roadrunner and the Coyote is filled with all these strange structures and abandoned places, and it's obviously littered with all the sort of the machinery that the Coyote brings to bear and all that. But it kind of adds to, I was talking before about the sort of desolation of the setting, compared to other cartoons which tend to have a domestic or at least urban setting. It's got that. Because this is American pop art, this is like mid 20th century American pop art, and it's very for the masses, and it's these things were played before the big mainstream films of the 50s. It's got that kind of strange filtering of the hinterland of America, hasn't it? It's set out in these places where very few of the kind of, I can't remember if it's the 1950s, but it was in that kind of part of the early to mid 20th century that the population of America became more urban than rural. That flip happened where more Americans now lived in cities. than lived in the countryside, which obviously is only intensified. But it's this strange sort of, I wouldn't exactly say haunted, but because it's hilarious, and it's ridiculous, but it's this strange, skewed landscape that I kind of like. A lot of Americans would have grown up near or would have known of, if they hadn't had particular experience of the Southwest, But it's and you've got the coyote and the roadrunner as these kind of Native American fauna, haven't you? So it's just very American, in a way, but in an interesting way, which hasn't tied it to a specific time in the same way that Tom and Jerry is or Bugs Bunny is, really,
Well, yeah, it's strange that you want to detach it from, like we were saying earlier, from time and place. To make it feel sort of otherworldly or very othery. But you can't do that entirely because it literally involves roads quite a lot and cars and trains. So is the reason that the landscape is so strange to these animals, well, not the roadrunner, who seems to have the lay of the land pretty well, but the coyote, could you put that down to it being sort of a strange world where roads and infrastructure have been put in, and it's... Could you spin it that way? Say it is an allegory for the I don't know, the intrusion of human infrastructure into the wild. I wouldn't say that. That would make me a dick. But it's a thing. It's something that's there. Because you can't quite detach it from the human world when every episode there will be a truck or a train going past that crushes him.
Yeah, or like you say, just at least a road. I mean, there are things like telegraph poles as well.
Oh, my favourite ever gag involves a telegraph pole.
Yeah.
That's not in the first 10 though.
I'm
not sure what episode that's in.
There's one in the first 10 which I like just for its simplicity. But yeah, I think you're right. It's I like the Mad Maxy sort of potential, sort of like this is perhaps post-apocalyptic though. It doesn't necessarily have to be like set in the past. It could be set past, present, or future. That untimeliness is something which I hadn't really considered until now. But you're right that it is timeless because it's these huge rural areas.
I've just had a horrible collision of two pop culture thoughts, which is the Wile E. Coyote standing in a sort of southwest desert landscape. There's just roads and telegraph poles, middle of nowhere. Gets one of his Acme deliveries. Delivery guy comes. It's a little box this big. Opens it. It's Gwyneth Paltrow's head. Gutted. That's not what he ordered.
The Roadrunner has the upper hand.
Yes. Greed was my sin.
It's got a little sign saying, "What's in the box?"
I like this. This would be good. It was only on the last episode, actually, we were talking about Roald Dahl. I was talking about how Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a bit like Seven.
Yeah, it is.
In Going Gosh is the third Roadrunner cartoon, and it came out later in 1952. So they obviously, I guess they would have started making them both, I guess, in 51. But it's funny what you're saying about the intrusion of human vehicles into the environment, because the nearest thing to a formula that they're developing in those early ones is that they all end with the Roadrunner being revealed to be the passenger or the passenger in a human vehicle. So like the first one ends with, I think he's in a car or a truck, and then the second one ends with him on a train that's just hit the coyote, and then the third one ends with exactly the same gag. So it's almost, you're almost glad at the end of the fourth one when you watch them sequentially like this that they don't do that again. It's kind of, I think they have a truck, but they don't show the Roadrunner, because that's becoming a bit stale.
He appears to be driving the truck as well. He's in the driver's seat.
That's right. Yeah. So he can sort of, although he belongs innately to this world, there's sort of hints that he can escape from it, or cross over into the human world in a way the coyote couldn't. Saying that the coyote is ordering products somehow.
Yeah.
That almost suggests. I don't know. Do you ever see the truck and the Roadrunner in the same place when you're not seeing him sort of like driving? That kind of suggests that maybe the Roadrunner is always the driver of the truck, and maybe it really is no other creatures or souls live in this landscape. But yeah, I don't really like those endings. I don't really like the sort of like Roadrunner driving a vehicle. I think that's a bit. I was going to say it's a bit stupid, but I mean everything's a bit stupid.
Well, it's too Jerry Mouse, really, isn't it? It's like we were saying before about them distilling down the good things about Tom and Jerry. It's too like that side of Jerry when he's taunting Tom and he's kind of celebrating a hard-earned victory, and it's not kind of, it's just not what these cartoons should be about, really.
It's not becoming, is it?
It's not becoming. It's not becoming of the Roadrunner.
Surviving is one thing. Surviving well is another thing. Humiliating your opponent, that is also fine. but just rubbing it in, no.
Good. Rich, I want to get back to you. Teased us a little bit there with saying that what your favourite gag in the whole of Roadrunner is, because I want to get back to that in a minute, because we're coming up on mine, not quite, but in the 5th instalment. But before that, there's the 4th instalment, Zipping Along, which came out in 1953. This may have played before such hit movies as From Here to Eternity and War of the Worlds. I was looking up some of the movies that some of these would have played as trailers to, which is really interesting. I'd love to go back in time and experience one of those audiences. I really wanted to highlight the bit in this because it's a rock swing gag where he's standing kind of try to describe this properly. Like he's got a rock tied to a rope that pivots in the middle on a beam, and he's standing on another beam, and he just lets it go. It just misses the Roadrunner. This is that thing where you could debate forever. Like the Roadrunner stops just in time for it to miss him, but he shows no sign of panic or changing his course or anything like that. For all we know, he was just going to stop there anyway. But it misses him, and it's just that. Do you remember like the rock keeps going up again? It's that thing of spatially where the coyote is. It's going to hit him again, but it's just that cut back to the coyote, and he's just looking up with a position of utter resignation at the boulder that's about to smash her into oblivion. It's just that look on his face of utter doom and the growing shadow on him. It's glorious.
But yeah, that's my favourite gag, and I think it's partly because of the look on the coyote's face as this huge boulder sort of like comes over and barrels down on him.
Yeah, and again, it's almost like the opposite of a surprise, isn't it? I mean, well, it's all the opposite of a surprise because he's going to fail every single time. But so none of this should work. But it's always the way in which we fail. He says, sounding like something from The Dark Knight Rises. Rich, tell me, because in the 5th instalment, Stop, Look and Hasten, I wasn't familiar with the cartoon kind of overall, but a clip from it is my favourite Roadrunner gag. But before I say what that is, what is your favourite Roadrunner gag of all time?
I've got two. I don't know, and they weren't in the first 10 that we specifically rewatched. I haven't seen them in ages, but I definitely remember them from when I was a kid. Okay, so I'll do one, and if you want to hear the other one, I'll try and just describe it. Okay, so the coyote is lying down, sort of peering over a cliff edge, and below him on the ground is the Roadrunner eating either berries or bird seed or something like that. So the Roadrunner gets it. So Wile E. Coyote gets a grenade, pulls the pin out, and the grenade falls. Doo! Catches on a telegraph wire, and of course springs back up. Boom. Boom. And of course has that moment where it pops up right next to the coyote's head, pauses in midair for like half a second, like it always does, and it explodes. Ha 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 ha. The dust and the smoke clears. He is there all charred and dizzy-eyed, just holding the pin, looking straight down the camera, and then just drops the pin. The camera remains focused on the coyote's face. You hear the pin go, doo, bounces on, you hear it go bong on the cable, bounce back up, and it's now a grenade and explodes again.
I'd forgotten it was now a grenade. I was imagining the pin came up and exploded absurdly.
Just suddenly a grenade, a grenade pops up and goes again. My other favourite one.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about that one. That's great.
Yeah, it's great. It's just out of nowhere. It's a big sort of fuck you. The other one is it's around the same sort of time, but it's a 50s one. It cuts to a chase already sort of in media race, and but it's Roadrunner's running along the side of a river, and Coyote's in a speedboat, and he's speeding alongside the Roadrunner, and he climbs out from the driver's seat onto the prow and just reaches, he's about to get him, and then looks forward, and of course there's a waterfall coming. He panics, jumps behind the seat, he's trying to turn the boat shoots off the end of the waterfall over thin air, but of course this being cartoon land, you've got a couple of seconds to right yourself before you fall. He manages to turn it and shoot back onto the water, breathes a huge sigh of relief, and then goes over another waterfall. There's just...
It's like literally physically impossible, isn't it? Given what you've just seen.
Yeah, but impossible. Yeah, like we've just seen him like racing along a river that has now developed another sort of Angel Fall style waterfall immediately behind the one that was just flowing over. It's impossible.
Could be a spring in the middle, like a natural water spring.
It's just so quick.
I remember that one, Rich. That is one of those ones that stands out to me, just because it's any of those moments where you kind of think that he's just about survived. It's how is this going to turn upside down? And another waterfall is funnier than any other thing that could have happened there. The boat could have exploded. Like it could have been a low bridge, anything like that. But just another waterfall is the last thing you think of.
If the boat had just exploded, I think I almost prefer that gag.
Well, there's a few, like, because obviously each attempt will fail. That's so the jokes. Well, the question you ask yourself: is it funnier if I can work out how it's going to fail and watch it inevitably pan out, or is it will you surprise me with how it fails? Do you remember the character Unlucky Alf from Fast Show?
Oh yeah, Paul Whitehouse character, isn't he?
Well, because there was one very early Unlucky Alf joke where he's walking down a street, turns to camera, and at the end of the street you can see some roadworks, and he goes, "Look at that roadworks, building a hole down there. Knowing my luck, I'll fall down that hole." And he walks off, takes about 2 minutes, and falls down the hole.
Oh, that's the one where it literally shows you him walking away from the camera for about 2 minutes, doesn't it?
Yeah. And then at the end, he's right on the horizon of the crest of the street and falls in the hole. So there's a few like that with where it's obvious what's going to happen, and watching it is still really funny. I can think of one right now. It's a really early gag. It's one of the establishment gags. Again, I'm not sure if it's in the first 10 or not. They're running. They're chasing each other, which is standard. And it's one of those ones where it sort of pans back and you can see a sort of archway cliff like that. But there's a tiny, maybe 2 foot gap between like the bit that jetties out from the left and the bit that comes in from the right. And the roadrunner runs, stops right on the edge, steps over very carefully onto the next bit of like the what's it called when the rock sort of sticks out? That anyway, and then runs off. The coyote comes along, same place, looks at it, looks at the camera, knows full well what's going to happen, and you know what's going to happen, steps over very gently onto the rock, which then, of course, collapses and falls. And it was just as soon as you saw the setup, you knew what was going to happen. It was the waiting for it to happen, and that's another thing that's really, really funny. So yeah, it's quite a difficult balancing act to flip between the ones where you're surprised and not. And they're still being funny.
I think. I was just going to say that, like, those ones which sort of recur, and you kind of see how they've played out a few different ways. They're the kind of things that I think. There comes a point where it becomes a little bit exhausting, and then when they get wildly sort of like completely illogical again, that's when they become funny again. I think it's that nice sort of like peak trough and then peak beyond the original peak of humour that works in those. But I kind of like that there are running gags, like even from episode to episode. It doesn't have to be in one episode. It can just be the kind of things that if you know the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, the kind of tropes that they often play out.
I've just thought of another one where it's inevitable. It's the just add water to the boulders. That's one of the first 10, isn't it? Where is
that where he's holding it in his hand above his head?
Yeah, and he's holding it like above his head, and he's just added water, and you just know that it's what's going to happen, and it's the speed which suddenly a small pebble in his hand turns into into a massive house-sized boulder.
Why has he suddenly got trouble getting boulders as well? No, I agree. That's great. I was thinking the other day that these are kind of, cause, these cartoons are industrial product. They're collaborative. We talk about the auteurism of Jones and Maltese. But like they are made by teams. They're made by huge teams of people, technical specialists, animators, sound effects people, musicians, and writers. And they're put out there, in cinemas around the world. The sort of development of them is this collective endeavour, and it's some of it's done by the same individuals, but some of it's kind of passed on industry knowledge and experience as well. But it turns it into I think this is aided by it being a silent, not silent, but shorn of vocal talent. It's not that kind of thing. It's not a star vehicle or a charisma vehicle in that sense. It's a true sort of comedy laboratory, because people say that comedy's not a science. It's very hard to pin down what makes it funny, and that's true. But if you agree that the basic dynamics of the Roadrunner cartoons are funny, I think these cartoons, through this sort of golden age of them, is like maybe the closest to a comedy laboratory like that we've seen. And it's because I'm about to talk about my favourite gag of all time. You see this happen in the 4th instalment, but then in this 5th instalment, Stop, Look and Hasten, it's better. So I want to talk first about the one I think's perfect. This is my favourite Roadrunner gag, and it's the one in the middle of Stop, Look and Hasten, where it opens on a quite wide shot of a bridge going between two rock faces, and the coyote's plan is that he's put birdseed in the middle of the bridge, a little circle in the middle of the bridge, and then he retreats and climbs underneath the bridge, and he's going underneath the bridge with a saw poised for action. So then you hear the Roadrunner running along. The Roadrunner stops in the middle of the bridge, stops dead, starts pecking away at the seed, just innocently having a great time. And the coyote's underneath that, and his plan, you very quickly realise, is to cut out this little circle that the Roadrunner's standing on, so that the Roadrunner will presumably plummet to his death. I don't know, like if somehow this will work. But in that long, so you've seen all this play out. The coyote starts sawing away, and then it cuts back to that original long shot. He does it, and the moment the coyote makes contact with it and makes the complete circle, rather than the small circle that the Roadrunner's standing on fall down, the entire rest of the world seemingly falls down instead. The entire bridge, the cliff face attached to the bridge, and the coyote himself just crash, down to the world falls into itself somehow, and the exact opposite of what should happen happens while the Roadrunner looks down and it meeps as it fades to black, which is just perfect. But one of the reasons, and this is again, I was realizing about the cinematography of these cartoons. That happens. The same sort of gag happens in the fourth one, and it's good. It's still a good gag, but it's not as good because it's to do with the bridge. The Roadrunner's running across the rope bridge. The coyote is poised with a knife to cut the rope bridge, and just as the Roadrunner's reaching up to him, the coyote cuts the rope bridge, and the rock that the coyote is standing on falls down. It's still funny. But it's knowing that in the very next cartoon, I don't know if the animators watched that and go, "Oh, we could have done that better," but or if they kind of had the same idea and they, the animators having not seen that cartoon at all, just decided, "Oh, we're going to do it a different way." But it works better because you've got that set up. You show the whole thing, show the kind of scale of it, the scope of it. It's great.
I was thinking about that joke as well because I think that is the best joke because I think it's the one that sums it all up best. It's the one where there is literally nowhere else. There's nothing else he could possibly have done, and the universe, the animator / the universe are willing to conspire that much against him that they're almost willing to destroy everything to save the Roadrunner and kill him. So I think that's why I think it's the best one. And the other reason I think it's really good is there is a type of gag, which is a physics gag where the physics doesn't work, that has appeared in some of the earlier episodes. It's different, but if you start with this one. There's a rock, a huge boulder hanging over the road, propped up by a smaller one with a string on it. Pulls the string, and the boulder just falls on top of him. Now, there's no way it could have done. It was on the other side of the road, and it's now fallen on him. The reason it doesn't quite work is because clearly what's happened there is something's changed of the world. Something's gone horribly wrong in the physics, but it wasn't quite brave enough to stare it in the face and show it. Whereas with the one you've described, we're going to pan back and show you how much we're willing to throw the laws of everything you understand into the bin to thwart this guy.
Although your grenade gag that you highlight is kind of a version of that, isn't it? Because it's so shameless.
Yeah. I guess so. It seems smaller, whereas yours, the one you've picked, seems more of a statement.
The gag that you just said then, Rich, I think there's another example of that sort of completely bending the laws of physics. Sort of, there's something tilting, and then it falls the wrong way. Where I think he's cutting down a tree. Coyote's cutting down a tree, and he's getting to the last chop. But what's funny about it is it begins to fall towards the road, so it begins to fall that way, and then it just goes the other way. Whereas the rock that you were mentioning just falls immediately the wrong way, and it's almost like you're right, Dave, about them sort of maybe investing a little bit more in the gag and sort of looking and sort of reworking them and sort of taking the same core elements of them, but thinking how can we do this differently, and even using a bridge twice, is sort of it looks like they found the formula there. It's it has to be a bridge, and what we're going to do is we're going to make the Roadrunner stop this time. And so, you can tell they're thinking it. But I think also, whilst we're talking about Stop, Look and Hasten, I noticed that it just looked more aesthetically polished. I felt like it was they're investing more time in it. Either that or just animation techniques have sort of improved a little bit to that point. But I think they are investing more in these characters. I think they're taking these characters a bit more seriously at that point. So I think they probably are looking at previous gags and sort of going, oh, how can we do that like differently enough for it to still be funny, but how can we improve on it?
Yeah, I agree, and it definitely brings rewards. And obviously, that we were talking before about self-aware cartoon characters. That cartoon also ends with the Roadrunner spelling out "That's all, folks" in its own dust. So it can be seen from the air, which shows quite a lot of self-awareness.
I've just thought, David, about what you were saying about refinery, because one of my favourite jokes from the earlier ones, I've just realised it is the same joke as the grenade, but the grenade makes it better. It's the one the coyote puts birdseed down, but laces it with like shot pellets, right? And the joke is that the Roadrunner comes past, eats the seed, and eats all the metal. Off he runs. Coyote pops out with a huge comedy Acme magnet, the horseshoe magnet. You can see all the magnetic beams that only exist in cartoons coming off it. And of course, rather than attracting the Roadrunner, he attracts a massive barrel of TNT out of nowhere and kills it. That has never existed. Its existence has never been hinted at. It's just there because it needs to be there. I think the grenade is a better version of that joke, polished.
Yeah, there's slightly similar ones where it spells out. I suppose these crossover. We should almost have done a categorization of like all the different sorts of joke you can have in something like this. But I think we're sort of constructing one now. But there's that one where he's created a Burmese tiger trap, and it's labeled Burmese tiger trap, and he runs away, hides. He hears zooming past, something falls into the trap. He goes over, jumps in, and he's caught a Burmese tiger. Because of course that's what you would catch in a Burmese tiger trap. Why a Burmese tiger is in the southwestern US desert is not examined. You know?
I love that he doesn't get like blown up or sort of like torn to pieces or anything. There, he just comes out completely white. He's just like so shocked, and he sort of like just runs away. I really like that. I like that he's sort of it's not the usual sort of like completely blown to pieces. So a different take on it.
That joke also sort of it plays into a certain sort of comic cartoon crack of mine that I love. I like any cartoon where the protagonist or whatever are slightly anthropomorphized version of animals. But occasionally there'll be one that randomly isn't. Like the tiger was not a suave or bullyish, biped. It was a just straightforward tiger.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Slinks off.
I love it when that happens. It happens fairly infrequently, but I love it.
It's the goofy Pluto thing.
Yes, precisely. Yeah, but funnier and less wholesome.
Okay, so we after that we go through Ready Set Zoom, which came out in 1955, and one of the things I liked, apart from just the Latin gag at the start, when they're doing the taxonomy of the creatures, they call the Roadrunner Speedopus Rex, which is a great joke.
I like that. Yeah.
But my highlight of this one was it was just that, again, it's just the timing. The coyote has, I can't even remember what the circumstances are, but he ends up with some dynamite. Is he glued to it? It's where he gets caught in all the glue and he ends up gluing himself to the dynamite.
Yeah.
Oh yes, that episode's amazing. Sorry, that might be the best one in the run. The first 10 run.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I have a different best one of these first 10, but yeah, it's the one where he gets caught up in the glue. It just keeps it gets worse and worse for him. He gets caught with it, and he ends up like glued in this sort of like weird little like crunched up shape, and he's got the dynamite next to him. He can't extinguish it by anything except he sees that there's some water near him, so he just runs over to the water. He's nearly there, and he jumps off the cliff, and the whole thing just detonates when he's like a meter away from the water that would have extinguished the dynamite. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what, actually, like I kind of want to rework my favorite gag. I think that one is my favorite gag because you've seen that the Roadrunner run through a load of sort of like viscous liquid before. I think it was concrete. He's previously run through, and it just doesn't affect him. He's like concrete, grease, glue, anything like that, and he just sort of like parts the waves. And it ends up all over the coyote, but it's the way that the coyote then handles whatever liquid he's been covered in. But I put it's not so much my favourite gag. I just there's right at the end. There's the coyote gets a female Roadrunner costume.
Okay, I'm glad. I was going to bring this up as well.
And so he's thinking that he's going to sort of slow the Roadrunner down or stop him, attract him somehow, and just hundreds of other coyotes start appearing from behind the rocks.
And all of them hungry, slavering with knives and forks that we've never seen before.
Yeah, it's that kind of like like appreciating his own victim side of things here is, you know, the predator prey sort of reversal that I quite liked. Not so sure about the whole female Roadrunner costume thing, but because I don't think we know whether the Roadrunner is male or female. I kind of like it being asexual.
I think that's so interesting you should mention that. I think for some reason as a kid I assumed the Roadrunner was female, but then kind of realised when I was about 10 or something that it canonically was male.
I think he's got like big lashes.
Canonically, what we're talking about, but you know, I think he's thought of as a male character for some reason.
I think he's got big eyelashes, which is classically sort of a female trait in cartoons, isn't it? But maybe I'm getting that wrong. I'm sure you see sort of like close-ups of the Roadrunner. He's got these big sort of like doe eyes. But yeah, no, I think I always thought of him as a boy, but I prefer thinking of him as a asexual, just not really sort of like, you know, it's not important.
Yeah, it's certainly not important to these. Yeah. The seventh one, the seventh cartoon in the sequence, Guided Muscle, which came out in 1955 as well. I actually have a note on that because one of my favourite sub-gags of the Roadrunner is, we were talking before about how aware the Roadrunner should be, but we're also talking about the Roadrunner just being this creature that, you know, just luxuriates in its own speed and, you know, like just enjoys the sheer joie de vivre of just being as fast as it is. But one of my favourite gags that they often use near the start of the cartoon, just to establish how, I guess for a fresh audience, how fast the Roadrunner is the gag where the character is chasing it and he's kind of nearly catching up to it, or at least keeping pace with it, and then it reveals that it has a previously untapped fifth gear, where it zooms, it just, you know, zooms off and is instantly at the horizon. My favourite version of that is in Guided Muscle, because and again it's the framing and the timing, because he turns around, he's running backwards for a bit at the same speed while he, you know, meeps at the coyote, but then he zooms off and it cuts to a wide shot of the horizon, a winding road that leads to the horizon. And I remember, I didn't do this on this rewatch, but I remember doing this as a kid because how nerdy I was. I freeze framed it, you know, on the old VHS kind of frame by frame thing, and the Roadrunner is at the horizon in 3 frames. you see the road get lit up with his dust, you know, for 3 frames. He's already at the horizon. So to the naked eye, he's basically at the horizon instantaneously, and it's obviously it's sold with the coyote's astonished reaction. But it's how far away the horizon is and how winding the road is to get to it. That's what sells it, you know, and the speed of it. It's just great.
Is it one of those ones where the road in his wake sort of like comes off the ground and sort of like it's ribbon? Like that's the force of his running, that it sort of makes the road go slack because of his speed.
I'm not sure if it happens in that one, but I certainly know what you mean.
I like how they play on that a few times, don't they? Because it does different things. The road, like it'll either set on fire or like I love the ribbon effect. That's great.
The ribbon effect, yeah. Because I was thinking about this while rewatching these. Is I take that entirely for granted now. That's one of the ways you let cartoon audiences know that this thing was fast, is the road becomes ribbon-like. But presumably that would have taken some leap of imagination from an animator or writer to come up with that image. Presumably,
yeah.
That's become just part of the grammar of cartoons. I think that's fairly impressive.
You touched on something very interesting there, because these, you know, the classic kind of Warner Brothers cartoons have an aesthetic that's quite distinctive. You know, like across the different cartoon characters and everything, they tend to look quite similar, quite, you know, on brand for the sort of 50s cartoons. But it's a very different aesthetic to, we've talked before. We talked about this on our Roger Rabbit episode, Drew, about the sort of silly symphonies aesthetic of the, I guess, more the 1930s. You know, the one that we mentioned was used recently by the video game Cuphead, you know, to create this kind of weird world where everything's pulsing and everything's kind of in flux, and, you know, the world's very animistic and alive, and, you know, it's a very shifting landscape. And although the surrealism of Roadrunner cartoons is, you know, it's a weird surrealism, but it's a very angular, controlled surrealism, isn't it? Like the landscape doesn't tend to be in flux in that sense. It's like, you know, things might not work to the laws of physics as we know them, but they're very rigid and controlled, and it's a very controlled environment in that sense.
Yeah, I think anything that becomes a bit more fluid, anything that like ribbon, like, is such a good word for like how the road sort of like pulls up, because it does sort of like shift like you know, like it's fabric. It's ingenious to see. I'd love to be the animator who thought that up, because it's I feel like that gets used in other cartoons now. It's almost like I can imagine this being the genesis of that kind of idea. And they kind of touch up on something like that in Who Framed Rodger Rabbit, where God, what's he called? The detective. He
Valiant.
Eddie Valiant.
Eddie Valiant. It's not like we did a whole podcast on it or anything. But yeah, like Valiant grabs the middle of the road, like the white line in the middle of the road, and pulls it up, and it becomes like ribbon when he's being chased down, and he throws it sort of like towards a wall, and she just follows it straight into.
That's a great bit.
It's a good bit, isn't it? Yeah, it's a good bit. I like it. Just going on that sort of like a winding road gag. I don't know if you guys picked up on it. I said I can't remember whether I saw it in one of these 10. But there's only one episode I clocked where the Roadrunner is going zigzagging sort of like along the road, but the Coyote is just going straight down the middle. He's going off road, and it's the first time I've seen him actually do that. Usually he sort of like follows the Roadrunner like pace for pace. But yeah, I just kind of liked that. Even that, a simpler gag, that sort of like winding road, has its own sort of like malleability and something you can play with it.
Guided Muscle is the one that I was texting you guys excitedly the other night when I watched it, saying it was kind of the most perfect of these 10 that we've watched. For me, it just runs and runs and runs, and it's it's about 6 minutes, and it's just perfect every single bit of it. I think one of my other favourite bits was just the bit. It's not even the main gag, but there's a catapult bit where the catapult just flings him into the ground about 30 meters away. It looks really terribly painful and demoralizing, and he seems to agree, because to just the perfect music cue, you see him in long shot just try and get up, and then he just slumps to the ground again, and it fades to black. It's just this time he's staying down. He's rethinking it. It's not the end of the cartoon, but it's just a little bit. But the other amazing bit, because I actually meant to get more into this, but this is maybe a topic for another time. Is like the comic impact of explosions, like well-timed explosions, because like there's a bit the last gag in this basically is he's rigged explosives to go off onto the road, and it's a classic thing of the Roadrunner goes over and they don't explode, and the Coyote short-sightedly runs out after them, but it's just and it just cuts to a shot of the road, and the Coyote runs into frame, and just at the exact perfect moment the perfect explosion goes off, and it's comically large, and the Coyote's just left there when it clears, just hanging there, ashen, and it's the one where he's in mid-air frozen, and he just gets down, like he climbs down from the air, and then puts up the sign saying that appealing for someone else to take his place, basically.
Yeah, it's something like
it's had enough.
Apply to the manager of this theatre, isn't it, or something like that? One of those.
That's right, yeah, and that's a really nice dated reference, isn't it? In that you've got a reference to the actual location of the original screenings of these.
Yes, exactly.
The theatrical experience.
The only way you can sort of access these is going to the cinema. Do you want to hear my favourite gag in that one?
I do.
So I think he's got birdseed or something, but for some reason the Roadrunner stopped at the bottom of this ravine, and he's got a fishing line, and he winds down a lit piece of TNT, stick of TNT sort of on this fishing line, but the fuse just goes like up the fishing line, down across the fishing rod, over his arm, down his back, and then into the box of TNT that he's got. And it's almost like he doesn't do anything about it as well. He just kind of like sees this happen, and he's just, what can I do? And the whole thing explodes.
That's the one where there's then that drum roll, isn't there? And he looks at the camera just with that look of absolute dread on his face. He knows exactly what's about to happen.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
That's such a good one. I had notes on this one that this is the one that I mentioned before, where there's the variant on the magic painting thing, where the bridge is real for him inconveniently when it's not real for the Roadrunner. This also, my favourite gag in this one was the one where he gets the sort of off-brand Batman outfit. It's just, I think it's sort of like a Batman outfit or whatever, but he's that green winged costume, and unlike the Superman costume he wears in the first one, this one does work, because they toy with the idea the same thing's going to happen, because he plummets initially after taking off, but then he pulls it back, like almost like in Goldeneye in the plane at the beginning, like he just pulls it up, and just like swoops up and like majestically flies through the sky, does a few like little rolls and stuff, and then it cuts to a side shot of him flying, and he's swooping through the air, taking these like almost like breaststroking through the air, and then just as he's found his stride, he looks in a self-congratulatory way towards the camera, just like and then immediately smashes into a cliff face.
Yeah, and what's like the ending of that gag? I think the membrane between the sort of like braces of the wings falls out, and then he's trying to fly with just like like the bare bones of it.
We're near the end of this run now, but the ninth edition was There We Go Go Go. That was just the year after. I think this is 1957 we're in now. That's the one with the gag you were talking about, where he has the kiln where he cooks his food and then the bin to put the food in. This has one of my favourite bits, which I definitely had seen in a compilation before, which is the bit where he's got the boulders suspended in a trap above the road, and they don't go off for the Roadrunner, and then he goes up and, even short-sightedly, even for him, starts poking at them from below to dislodge them, and you start to see it starts to work. You start to see pebbles falling down, and then he realizes what he's doing, and he holds up a sign to the audience saying, "In heaven's name, what am I doing?"
That's the first of the recurring little umbrella protection.
Yeah, he's got a little parasol, which is like his plan B.
Yeah, little parasol.
Yeah, that's a great one. Did you ever highlight that one, Drew?
I like the opening gag with that. They're making chicken out of clay. And then just making a pedal bin out of clay when he realizes that none of it works. And again, that's one good example where he doesn't necessarily need the Roadrunner. He just he's sort of foiled by his own silly sort of ideas. But yeah, I think that the ending of that is very memorable as well. I like that little sign he holds up.
The 10th cartoon in this sequence, Scrambled Eggs, brings us up to 1957, and that's so we've actually gone into the late. Well, the second Eisenhower term here. We've got all the way from the Truman presidency to almost the Kennedy era. And actually, 57, there's loads of other seminal Warner Brothers cartoons we could have talked about here. We've mentioned Duck Amuck. I was going to mention in terms of like the structural, spectacularness of some of these Warner Brothers cartoons. Dodgers in the 24th and a half century came out in the early 50s. 1957 is the year that What's Opera Doc came out. So that's something that audiences got to enjoy in this year as well. But what was your highlight of Scrambled Eggs, Drew?
We touched on it earlier, but the dehydrated boulders thing was very funny because of the timing of it, and I kind of think that's almost of the time a sort of contextual idea of what the future holds. These sort of like pill form, like rehydrated meals and things that the way that they were thinking in the 50s 60s was you could get anything sort of miniaturized and then somehow blow it up. So I kind of like that. But because we've talked about that, the very last gag in that episode is quite funny. It's like Coyote's got a steamroller that he's chasing Roadrunner with, and it's working. This is the first time you see his gag, his like contraption actually working. And then there's like a little sign saying something like, "In case of steamroller, detour this way." And Roadrunner sort of like takes that detour, and the steamroller carries on going. And then there's a tunnel, and so the Roadrunner goes through the tunnel on this detour. And this is where you realise Coyote set up this more elaborate thing than just the steamroller. There's this sort of facade of this tunnel with a cannon behind it, and the Roadrunner goes into the cannon, and then the Coyote lights the fuse. But the fuse doesn't. I don't think the fuse works or something. So
it doesn't go off. So the Coyote sticks his head over, and you expect it to go off then, but it doesn't. He looks at the camera in a way that suggests, I know what happens here. It's inevitable, so I have to. Then looks again, and it goes off. And the Roadrunner is riding the cannonball, like completely unscathed. And of course, the Coyote just walks off. Like you don't even see him do a look to camera. He walks off, just all smoking and smouldering. And that's the end. Yeah, that's a good one.
I think it's really good that we did that sort of chronological thing for the first 10, because I really it cemented a lot of the development of this stuff in my mind, and helped me kind of put together how they finesse this stuff, and how it it does form this sort of comic laboratory. It goes without saying that it should be said that this classic run of Chuck Jones directed cartoons, there were about 25 of these, and they did go from 1949 to 1964. A later run, I think mostly supervised by Chuck Jones, which to my mind are much less aesthetically satisfying. That they look cheaper, they're less distinctive. Carried on in the 1960s, and with occasional comebacks after that. Of course, a lot of these creative people went into TV animation, of course, because this is kind of the last great age of theatrical shorts, the relatively brief age of theatrical animated shorts. Which is. TV is becoming more popular during the 1950s. Obviously, it's very cemented in most American homes by the 60s, and it's and TV animation started to happen. You know, Hanna-Barbera were big pioneers in this, but they were mostly pioneers in ways that were fairly artistically detrimental. I think Michael Maltese went on to write for the Flintstones actually, and maybe some other shows in the 60s and 70s, but you know, I don't think they ever really hit the same creative peaks as they did in the sort of 1940s 50s partnerships. I just want to say thanks for.
Are you not a fan of Hanna-Barbera, David?
I mean, you know, I'll watch the odd Huckleberry Hound, the odd Snagglepuss,
The old Yogi Bear.
Do you not like Top Cat?
I do. I
like Top Cat.
My first ringtone was the Top Cat theme tune. I want to thank both of you for coming on, talking about the Roadrunner cartoons with me, because they're such a fascination, and you know, especially leading off our one on Rodger Rabbit, Dru. You know, if we were to single out any other part of animation history to talk about after that, immediately I thought that would be the natural fit. But I think you guys have really helped me tease out some of the things that I really like about them, you know, and some of the things that you know, come out when you analyze them a little bit more.
Yeah, no, it's been good. It's been nice to sort of have an excuse to look up something which I haven't really indulged in since, you know, maybe my early teens at the latest. Not so much, and it's been very nostalgic as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've learnt nothing I didn't already know. If anything, I've got stupider.
As to be expected. Thanks both of you, and I'll just play out the show now with our usual theme music. But yeah, thanks. I'll look forward to having you both on the podcast again in the future, separately or together. And thanks very much.
Cheers, mate.
Awesome. Thank you. Beep beep.
Meep meep.
Goodbye. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Blake Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @dbfagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert. So Rich, Dru's just left us now, but I just wanted to talk to you briefly as a sort of follow-up to our episode 3 that we did on westerns, because and this only chimes with the main Roadrunner topic of the conversation, only insofar as it involves a desert landscape really, and violence, of course. But at the end of that podcast, we talked about other westerns that we might want to sort of recommend to each other, check out, and they weren't exactly, you know, hot underground tips or anything like that, but they were just things we mutually hadn't got around to. Well, I got around to your one, which you said I might enjoy, Bone Tomahawk, the 2015 film. Director's name I forget, but that guy who made his name off that and a couple other films recently. I really liked it. I watched it last night. I'll tell you a bit about my reaction to it because you saw it first. Do you want to tell me what it was like for you to watch that?
Yeah, it was a while ago. It was strange because I was watching it with my sister. Well, yeah, and she recommended it to me, which is strange, or she suggested, because not normally that way around. So yeah, it was obviously all the westerny bits at the beginning I was, you know, well into, and I like it, like a bit of a horror theming, and basically all its ticks I liked, all its. If you're gonna do a kind of sort of folk horror-y thing, I like it when it gets a bit gross, and when it gets a bit weird, I should say, rather than gross. I still quite haven't recovered from the denouement, because I am squeamish. I think I understand that's a famous bit. I'm glad I saw it. Had my sister suggested that was coming up, I wouldn't have watched it.
I hadn't heard,
because I am so squeamish.
Because you often do hear.
I'd not heard of it.
You hear these things. I hadn't heard that. I heard it was violent, at least in parts, but I hadn't heard about that bit or anything. So we're talking about a particularly gory moment during the film's climax.
Yeah, when someone says, "Oh, it's like a western, like going to save the kidnapped wife," essentially, but it gets violent, I just thought it'd be like Wild Bunch violent, lots of shooting. I'm fine with that. Didn't quite have I say, I'm glad I got through it, and I liked its horror elements. I'm still recovering.
One thing I liked about it, because I didn't know much about it, except it had a reputation for being good, and stylish and also violent. I was expecting a completely different movie, really, especially tonally, because I was expecting something, because of the name, Bone Tomahawk, which is very grindhousey and kind of ridiculously OTT, almost like Hobo with a Shotgun levels of that kind of title selling. I thought it was going to be a bit like Dead Snow. I thought it was going to be like a kind of ridiculous Grand Guignol kind of, but in tone as well. I thought it was going to be like silly from the start. I thought it was going to be borderline parodic, like a sort of Tremors-esque kind of ridiculous archetypes and characters, and then it was just going to be bloodbath after bloodbath, like cartoonishly so. And it does get very violent towards the end, but it's not that, is it? Like it's I read some critic describing it as like Tarantino with all the messing about removed, and I kind of get what they mean there. It's kind of, actually, funnily enough, it came out the same year as The Hateful Eight, which we touched on a little bit before. But I really like the because I'm not one of those, because there's a lot of male film fans our age and demographic who kind of worship Kurt Russell a bit, probably a bit too much. But I actually really like Kurt Russell in this, just being, he tends to be quite relatively understated and kind of world weary and stuff. But I really liked him in this, being the kind of maybe the noblest character in it. Yeah.
Strangely enough, I don't really remember. I remember Kurt Russell. And I remember the actor. Is his name Matthew Fox?
Yeah. Yes.
Is it Matthew Fox? Who I knew as the fella from Lost, which is a show I don't like, and he kind of plays the sort of ambiguous figure, like the sort of basically the suave gunslinger whose history we don't quite know, but who seems to know what he's doing when it comes to violence. I was quite ready to not like him because I didn't like Lost, and I actually thought he was quite good. And again, I think with Kurt Russell being, it was the first sort of gruff Kurt Russell performance that I'd seen, where he was more of an old man than he was playing like some kind of 80s throwback. Like, oh my god, do you remember Kurt Russell? The performance, which I wanted. So those two things conspired. Yeah. Two slightly different performances than I was expecting.
Yeah. No, me too. Matthew. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because Matthew Fox is the character who, not in an unchallenged way, but he talks about how many Indians he's killed, doesn't he? Native Americans he's killed.
Yeah, something like that. I forget the details, but yeah, it's been a while since I saw it. It would have been about 2016.
He asks them how many he's killed, and like he implies it's a big number, and then before his character dies later on, spoilers, he numbers them, like 118, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people have been said The Searchers is a bit of an influence on this, amongst other things, and it's the sort of thing that John Wayne's character in that might have uncomplicatedly boasted of, but in this film it's all shot through with a bit more trauma and complication, and it's kind of there's maybe the implication in the background that he's keeping count, not for the uncomplicated reasons that John Wayne's character would have been, keeping count. But one thing I was just going to ask you about quickly was, do you think this film's racist? Because the reason I ask is that I came out of it kind of going, that was obviously a portrayal of a native species to America who are kind of implied to be not or barely human, but they have some of the accoutrements of Native Americans. They're sort of dressing in kind of native clothing. They seem to be like really mud encrusted and stuff. They're using bows and arrows.
Barely,
that's probably the main thing.
Barely, though. They're essentially just meant to be troglodytes. Well, yeah, but like bows and arrows are like, if you wanted, if this film was set in any part of the world where you wanted to portray a primitive humanoid species that have weird like larynx, that are 7 foot tall monster people.
Yeah,
they're going to be using bow and arrows because
artificial larynx whistles. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to be using bow and arrows because that's the sort of fundamental early tool of proto-humans. Or human.
Yeah, it just has a different valence if you're setting it in the actual historical West, don't you? Which it largely is. Yeah,
it absolutely does, and I think they do. Like, I know that director incidentally has run up against these sort of things, and I think that it's one of those questions that if I was in his shoes, I think you basically say, well, do I not tell this, or do I just not set it in the West? Where could I set this story? Where could you set a story where you wanted to have sort of rural, slightly isolated community attacked by monster people who are barbarians of some kind.
Yeah.
And then you go and get them. Where could you tell that story then?
Well, I suppose the decision is choosing to set a film where the bad guys are barbarian monster people who live in the desert, right? Because if you tell that story in the States,
Well, yeah, don't, like, that's it then. That's if we decided that that's a story you can't tell anymore. Like, you can't fictionalize monsters anymore. Presumably you couldn't tell Dracula anymore because you haven't got the Hungarians. I know it's Transylvania, but it's clearly Hungarian Transylvania. I know the Romanians are going to have a go at me.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? Like, very few people are saying you can't do that sort of thing anymore at all, despite some of the right-wing fantasies of the tabloids.
I know how I sound, and hopefully I've got enough goodwill to.
No, of course, yeah, no. I just mean, like, I don't think I'm suggesting at all that this movie shouldn't have been made and shouldn't have been made about what it was made about. I just wondered, because I was thinking afterwards, one of the other movies it reminds me of. I mentioned The Searchers already. I mentioned because you were talking about geographical areas of the world where you set things that rely on kind of slightly more quote unquote civilized people being scared of the people outside that civilization. You can bring up anything.
That's not quite what I meant. That's not quite what I meant. I didn't mean.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I'm misrepresenting you there.
No, not at all. I almost certainly misspoke. I just meant, like, if you wanted to tell the story of some people somewhere, anywhere, regardless where, who are, let's say we were telling it, and it turns out that up in the Peak District, there's or the lakes, or there's somewhere nearby us, there is some people. I mean, it makes a bit less sense. It's a small island. The whole point is it's been thoroughly explored. But there is some cave people. A bit like do you remember The Descent?
I'm glad you brought up The Descent. I was just about to mention it. Yeah.
Yeah. So somewhere in that's set in Britain, right? Yeah. So there is some underground, literally troglodyte people who they're not people, put it that way, who hunt and eat other humans. Well, what if you wanted to do that in the West? Would you say, we can't do it in the West now because even if we had a Native American character come in and say these people are they're not even humans, that's not enough because it might worry liberals. I don't know, and I am a liberal.
well, you see, I think that's the way they do cover themselves, because there's a character known as the Professor in those early scenes back in town, who does come in, and he's basically, not only is he by showing a learned, respected Native American, by some of the characters, Native American character, they sort of cover their back in that nice portrayal, sympathetic portrayal of him, but they also have him say explicitly, these weird things live over here, they are not us, they are not our people, So I think the audience has to make up their own mind about whether that's enough for them or not. The reason I was going to mention The Descent is obviously The Descent has an almost all female cast, and it certainly they're all women who get into that situation in the caves with confronting the monsters. That's obviously a film about a lot of the female bonding, but also the tensions between female characters that are heightened by this horrific situation. This film struck me as almost like eventually you get to points where you kind of get back on yourself, and you're having films made about masculinity and men which draw on these more groundbreaking examples. Because I thought this was a really nice film about male,
and not before time as well.
Yeah, because it's about time for us. No, I just thought this was amongst other things, one of the biggest surprises about it was it turned into quite a nice, sweet story about sort of male support and like male bonding. Like apart from all the horrific stuff that happens to them, just their sort of effort to get out to the place and to support each other and to help each other through injuries and the terrain and everything, and obviously the actual horrific situation they end up in. It ended up having a weirdly, again, spoilers, weirdly happy ending in some respects. Like, I mean, obviously Kurt Russell loses his life, a few of the others lose their life along the way, but kind of not quite uplifting, because it's grueling, but it is,
it's because the sweet deputy survives, who is the source of most of the comedy and the pathos. Because even the main character, the one whose wife's been kidnapped with the fellow with the broken leg, name escapes me, this is years ago. I can shrug about him. Like, he's like, I know he's why we're meant to be going, but I don't remember anything about him really. I just remember that I remember finding the older guy much funnier than I thought I would, but I can't remember any details of how or why. I think he was just sweetly stupid.
He was almost like a minor Deadwood character, wasn't he?
Yes, very good. Yeah, he definitely was.
Yeah. I thought it was, because I saw some other criticisms of the movie when I was reading up briefly last night about it is essentially, again, a bit like The Searchers, it's essentially a damsel in distress plot, like you literally end up, I almost thought of like something like Mario when, at the end they literally find her in a cage, You know, it's like if they found the castle where the princess is, and you know they rescue her. I think some of that.
Yeah, being held by monsters.
Yeah. I mean, some of that association comes off a little bit, I think, in the sense that they almost have this. I mean, you know, obviously people in the 19th century had sweet, supportive marriages, but in this you see Patrick Wilson, that's the guy who's like gets injured later on, but and his wife, they have this lovely relationship, including like this scene where they not really salaciously, but they just have this really nice sex scene, you know, where they're having like sex in different positions, and you know they're kind of like it's fulfilling for both of them, and that, you know that's kind of talked through. But then also Kurt Russell has that lovely marriage, you know, like him and his wife are just shown to be this like the sweetest couple, you know, and it's kind of it's almost like this nice little nod that like against grimdark, I guess, like for even period historical grimdark, of just like, yeah, every period in human history some people were having a nice, you know, a nice life essentially, you know, before it's uninterrupted by horror. You know, they weren't being modern people necessarily, but they were being mutually supportive and helpful and nice to each other. They were in love with each other, you know.
Yeah, I mean that would be nice. I mean, I'm just resentful.
Yeah, and there we have it.
People, you know, someone reminding me that not only are there many happy people in the world right now, but there are millions of, if not billions, of people before me who were happy and content as well. That doesn't help. Yeah. No, thank you.
Well, anyway, thanks for encouraging me to watch it. I enjoyed it. It was
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't remember much about it apart from just being fucking traumatized.
Yeah. That death. You know, people who've. I'll leave it. We've spoiled it a bit, but I'll leave that for people who haven't watched the movie. To enjoy that. The less you know about it, the better. But yeah, it was good. Well, thanks for hashing that over with me a bit.
I'm fine. I just make sure that I don't sound awful.
Yeah, I'll do all I can.
Thank you.
And that's all, folks.